Welcome to On Rails, the podcast where we dig into the technical decisions behind building and maintaining Ruby on Rails apps. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. In this episode, I'm joined by Nadia Odunayo, the solo founder and developer behind the StoryGraph, a fast-growing book tracking platform with over 4 million users. We talk about what happened when they tried to promote a progressive web app and why it didn't go quite as planned. From there, we get into how Nadia runs the entire product across web, iOS, and Android using Turbo to power native mobile clients. She shares how they approach in-app payments, tackled the challenges of syncing customer data across platforms, and what discoverability in the App Stores has meant for their business growth. Nadia joins us from London. All right, check for your belongings. All aboard. Nadia Odunayo, welcome to On Rails.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So let's start with a question I love asking. What keeps you on Rails?
I don't really have any other choice, to be honest. After graduating university, I did a software bootcamp, and Rails was what they taught me. This was back in September to December of 2013. So that's essentially all I've used. I worked at Pivotal for a year and a half, and I did do a little bit of Swift before I left, and a little bit of Swift on some side projects. And then I did a lot of work on Cloud Foundry, which was in Ruby and Go. But when it came to web development, the only platform I knew was Rails. And so when I first had the original idea for StoryGraph, which was a smaller side project, and I was just trying to get something quick out to test and use for customer research, Rails was the obvious option. And it's worked out really well for me because it's so stable, it's mature, there's so much online. So yeah, but it started just out of, it was the only platform I knew really well.
Did you intentionally choose that bootcamp because Rails was something that they were did you know about Rails before that, or was that just happened to be like that was the bootcamp that you were recommended to, or you found and they seem reputable and then you decided to go down that path and Rails just happened to be the tech stack?
I hadn't heard of Rails, I don't think. I had only started coding a few months before that because I'd won a place on the free coding course that Entrepreneur First, a startup accelerator incubator type thing, was doing. So they had this program called Code First Girls. And on that program, they taught us CSS, HTML, and Ruby. And while I was on that program, I was on Twitter and I saw a random tweet to win a place at a 12-week software bootcamp.
Oh, wow.
I just saw a competition. And the taste that I'd gotten from Code First Girls, I realized, being someone who's always been entrepreneurial, I realized how powerful it was to be technical, because I had been running like an e-publication called StoryGraph. There's a whole story around that while I was at university. And we had a friend who was helping us with the website. It was a WordPress website, but he was helping us. And I felt so restricted by having to wait for him to make changes and make updates. So when I started with Code First Girls, which was twice a week in London, I'm originally from London, but I was studying in Oxford, so I would go to London twice a week. I got the taste of how powerful this was. And so when I saw the chance to win a competition for a 12-week bootcamp, and I think probably it did say Ruby Rails in the advertisement, I thought, yeah, I just want to be technical. I want to be able to build my own websites and apps, so then I can make my own way, make my own money, not have to rely on anybody. And so I just applied for the bootcamp and I won the competition. So I went for free. But even just to put it in perspective, so my degree was in philosophy, politics, and economics. And even when I won the place on the 12-week bootcamp, which at the time was £8,000, I know it's more expensive now, it was free. I still was considering whether I should go or not because I had a stereotype in my mind of what a developer was. And I just thought, this would have been me starting to learn to code at 21. And I just thought, there's no way I can do anything decent with coding at this age. I honestly thought to be decent at coding, you had to have started when you were like 3. So I was asking around, saying, should I still go? And in the end, when I went, I thought, well, if I'm going to be an entrepreneur, like I don't really use that word anymore, but I said to myself, if I'm going to be an entrepreneur, going to the bootcamp is good because then I'll know how to talk to any developers that I hire. And now look where I'm at.
Right. Well, that's a fantastic story. And then you talked about Rails there, as part of that, and like you didn't have a choice because that just happened to be the thing that you wanted, and you saw it as a way that you could make more of an impact or be more involved and maybe not be so reliant on whoever, insert WordPress developer, web developer, software person over there that does all their magic work. You're like, you could do it yourself. You learned that you could remove those barriers, and you didn't need to be doing it since you were 3 or 4 years old to be able to contribute code somehow. And then you went into work at a software consultancy, and so you got to work on other people's projects, I would imagine, in that scenario. So, and we can dig into some of those topics in a little bit, but I'm really curious about thinking about StoryGraph. It's interesting that you had used the name before. Is there much of a connection between that, or is it kind of like a new version of what you had, or was it just a really good name that you were able to I'm going to repurpose the name?
The latter. So essentially, I had this e-publication. We had won a couple of grants and awards, so I set up a proper entity. When I stopped working on that, my mum actually said, keep the name, keep the company, just keep it dormant because it's such a good name. And the side project I was working on was originally called Read Lists. But when the project expanded to being a more broad reading tracker, I needed another name. And then I thought StoryGraph, so perfect. So I just repurposed that company that I already had.
You were writing your future. And
yeah.
Let's dig into the weeds a little bit. So you've been building and scaling the StoryGraph on Rails and doing that solo. How long have you been working on this business so far?
Since 2019. So okay. 2019 was when I started coding in earnest, is when I started the code base that StoryGraph is currently existing in or comes from.
I'm curious, as at that point you had worked at a consultancy and you're like, maybe this is a side project or whatever. I don't recall when that pivot started to happen, but what parts of the Rails ecosystem helped you keep things manageable as the app kind of began to get off the ground and start working on it? Because, we all know that Rails is great for spinning up your MVP for something. So we don't need to go into all that, but I'm curious, what sorts of things do you feel like the Rails ecosystem was a big contributor to that? How are you able to leverage gems or patterns available to you to kind of expedite some of that exploration with a new business?
I mean, from getting started, we know all the things that are super, super helpful from day one. Things like Devise, just having authentication out of the box, Sidekick for background jobs. There are so many tools that I use that are open source that it's just incredible. Like the fact that all of these tools are available built in and that I can just use them in my product is amazing. So there's that. But I would say, again, being a solo developer in the first year, having a tool like Heroku, we're not on Heroku anymore, was just super helpful because I didn't need to hire a DevOps person. And, Rails developers were very familiar with Heroku. And maybe later we can talk about why we had to move off of Heroku. And that's not quite Rails specific. I would say the number one key tool or feature or thing that's part of Rails that has meant that I can still be a one-woman developer with an app used by millions of people around the world is Turbo. Because that is the thing that means that I am running a website, an iOS app, and an Android app. And that was incredible. And we actually started using Turbo when it was still in beta, but we felt the pain of not having apps in the App Store and Play Store. We tried to push the PWA for so long, but ultimately, as long as people have gone to a website and saved it as a bookmark, even though it fundamentally behaved as an app in most ways, people psychologically, if they didn't get it from the App Store or the Play Store, it's not a real app, it's a website bookmark. So we pushed the PWA line for so long, and it got to the point where we just said, we need to have something in the App Store and Play Store. And so we used Turbo. So I would say that is the number one thing that's really helped me in the Rails ecosystem. And I have my co-founder, Rob, and he now manages all of our infrastructure and does all of our AI and machine learning. So that's another piece. But I'm still the sole web developer. And so he makes APIs on his end, which I still have to hook into the app. But yeah, I would say that reality of that one-person framework was made possible because of Turbo. That's
interesting. Was there a point, if Turbo hadn't existed, do you think you would have gone down and needed to figure out how to build out a native app?
So my original dream, before I when I went to boot camp and I was thinking about how I wanted my life to be, I'd always wanted to run my own business. I'd always been entrepreneurial. When I started to get technical, I was really into this idea of becoming an independent iOS developer. And I just imagined that I'd have a suite of apps and they would all just be profitable, a suite of tools, and that would be my thing. So I had started to learn Swift and get involved in the Swift community. So I think there was a part of me that was like, okay, if I have to figure out Swift, I might do that. I also was looking at things like RubyMine. That does both iOS and Android, right? I was looking at other tools that were out there, but the timing of Turbo was very fortunate for us.
I'm curious about, like, as a solo developer, was there a point when you were thinking like, hey, maybe we need to build out an APIs in your app, and then you'll build out an iOS and an Android app that interact with it? Or is this like, oh, we can just take this next step with Turbo and start evolving this way, and we don't even need to go down that path outside of maybe, I'm assuming you needed to have your Mac and run Xcode and be able to compile that to some degree, right? To get it into the App Store. So what was that kind of journey like for you?
Interestingly, even though I'm the Rails and the web developer, the push to actually try building out the apps with using Turbo Native came from Rob, because he was the one that was pushing the PWA line the most on social media. So he would always lurk on Twitter and see every time someone was complaining about that StoryGraph doesn't have an app. And the number of times he had this copy and paste of, we do, it's a PWA, XYZ. And so he, one night, did the research and he spun up the demo Android app. And I think he pitched me, he said, I know this is still in beta, but look, I, who am not a developer, was able to spin up the demo app. So imagine what you can do with this. Take a look. And I was really nervous. But then I remember, I think I saw that I think Hey was already built on it. And I remember thinking, if Hey is built on this thing, even though it's in beta, surely it's going to stick around. So let's go for it. So I never thought about an API. We immediately went to just using the web as basically having a hybrid app.
Okay. And with that, have you needed to expose an API to any other services? Is anyone kind of consuming your data elsewhere at this point?
No. The trickiest thing, though, and why from day one I had to do some native code, was in-app purchases. Because we had the Plus plan. And the platforms, I mean, Apple recently, obviously, they had a new policy change. But at the time, Google and Apple both had policies that said, whatever paid products you're offering on your website, you have to use our in-app purchasing systems. And so the hardest thing, the thing that consumed most of my time, was figuring out in-app purchases on both iOS and Android, because they're completely different. And also, because we were using Turbo in beta, this was the first time where I couldn't find anything online about anybody doing this. I spent weeks kind of experimenting, trying different things. And the trickiest part of it was figuring out how to connect a user to their paid subscription, which sounds like, surely that's easy. But I was keeping authentication on the server side.
Right, okay.
And the purchases is all like device-based. So I had to come up with ways to pass the user ID back and forth and reconcile essentially purchases made on a device, which lives on a device and had like device token or purchase token, with a user account in my Rails app. And that was the trickiest part of it all.
And that was, you had to entirely rely on device IDs type information? Do they not share like an email address or something? Or do they keep that kind of obscure for privacy?
There isn't built-in email addresses. But even so, here was another thing. People's Gmail account emails and iCloud or iTunes emails, Apple IDs, are often different to what they've used to sign up to StoryGraph. So I had to figure out ways to basically, in the webhooks and callbacks that happened between the native code and my web server, it's like a combo of what I call passing IDs between requests, going through the documentation, figuring out all the different types of messages that could be sent to our app, and then connecting things up like that. So that was like the trickiest part of putting the apps together. It took me 6 weeks of just focusing on it, which maybe doesn't sound long, but at the time, especially someone who was getting things out regularly every other day, I was genuinely concerned that our users would be like, oh, StoryGraph's dead, that we haven't heard from them in ages. But instead, we got messages like, oh, they must be working on something very exciting because that's the only reason why they'd be quiet for so long. And that was really testament to the trust that we'd built up with our users because of continually being transparent and things like that. But yeah, that was the trickiest part, the in-app payments part.
I know that's an issue for a lot of applications that have been dealing with that. Have you been able to get a sense of now that some of the regulations are coming out that maybe Apple's not going to have to be able to force it, and how that, like, will you be able to potentially remove some of that? Or do you think I've already built this and now we're in this kind of weird hybrid payment authentication system to keep it all connected? And out of curiosity, do you have a good sense of what percentage of people are on their mobile devices and using the app versus your web app, like approximately?
So it's about 60% on the apps across iOS and Android. More people actually use Android, which makes more sense because it's a global app. And so globally, more people are on Android. For a long time, when we were really pushing the PWA and focusing in on it, we were following the conversation with Apple and is it Epic Games or just different organizations that were trying to lobby for PWA, but also the payments, like the 30% payments or not allowing payments through another way. And then we were really hoping that things would move towards PWAs, but they didn't. Any case, as I said, there was that psychological blocker with users. If it didn't come from the App Store, it wasn't real. And so then we went all in on Turbo. And, Rob, when it was announced a few weeks ago that Apple is going to be changing its policy so that you can direct people to pay in the other way, and he kind of asked, what are you thinking? Are we going to change back or like revert or get off Apple Pay? And I said, the thing is, it's easier for a lot of people because what being on Apple Pay and Google Pay gives us is the easy conversion to your local currency. That's really easy. All the kind of conversion, tax things, that's all handled. And so without us having to like manually add different prices or that kind of things. So it's almost like we're so built into it now that it would be more work to kind of reverse it and focus in on just going through our own platform or through Stripe for everything. What I will say is that going forward, if we add more products, like more gifting options or things like that, knowing now that Apple doesn't have such stringent rules means that we can, put back certain things that we've removed or just more openly direct people to paying through the website. It's interesting though, because we recently got a violation on the Google app because we have links for people to redeem a Gift Plus account. And you can't buy a Plus subscription gift within the app because to simplify everything for me, I just said you could only buy Plus, subscribe monthly or annually, and I didn't want to deal with different product types and all of that. So I left gifting on Stripe. And it's so funny how these violations can randomly crop up. This has been this way since for 5 years now. And Google only decided or noticed recently. And when I went to hide the link from the Google Play app, I noticed that the only place it was visible was in the Google app. It was hidden from the Apple app, which means historically we were pulled up on the same thing by Apple. And so it's like, even if Apple policies have changed, Google still have the policy about you cannot direct people to pay for something that's not available in the Play Store. So it's kind of navigating the two ecosystems and what's visible in what app, and that it's easier to just keep it the same. So basically just do a common denominator of what's acceptable on both, than to try and, now that Apple has looser restrictions, let me do it this way, especially being a one-person development team. It's just, what's the common denominator that's allowed on both platforms? Let me just do that for now.
I would also imagine that, like, if for anyone that's like thinking, oh, great, we can get rid of that, or maybe thinking like a developer might be listening and their company already integrates with the App Store and they've been using that for payments. I think the biggest hurdle is like, well, you have paying customers right now. So what do you do with them? You can't just flip the switch and hope everybody's going to pull their credit card out again, because that's going to also introduce a moment for them to reevaluate if they want to keep paying for whatever your service is, if it's worth them pulling the credit card out again, or and canceling the subscription one thing and flipping it. Like you can't just move their credit card data, I'm assuming, between Apple and into your Stripe system, right? That's probably not ever going to happen. So I assume that's the case. I don't.
Definitely not. Like, something that is also interesting is, as a developer, what you can do, what powers you have over a user's subscription across Google and Apple, because they're different. For example, for Apple, as a developer, I cannot cancel a user subscription. That there's no API, there's nothing I can do. And so when people write in to say they want to cancel and it's an Apple subscription, I have to say we can't handle that. You have to go through the App Store. Google, I can cancel and I can do partial refunds, but there's no easy way for me to extend a user's billing date. With Apple, I can, but it's very involved. I have to have this key, produce a token, and I'm essentially doing like call requests from the command line. Say if there's a blip and someone's account is not matched up, or there was just an issue, and so I need to delay the billing date by like a month or whatever. I do that. And it's quite technical. And I'm thinking there's probably an easier way to do this, but this is the only way I found. So Apple is very technical in terms of management. There's no nice dashboard. Google has a dashboard, but all you can do is cancel and do refunds. You can't extend. So it's just, also Google are interesting. You have to have the Google email or the order ID. In our server, we store, or I only have access to, the purchase token. And when I'm viewing a specific subscription, I can copy the purchase token to cross-reference in my database. I cannot search by purchase token. So we had an interesting thing recently where we were DDoSed, and we just put on this bot protection, like Cloudflare bot protection, and it actually blocked Apple and Google's webhooks. So we ended up with a bunch of subscriptions that didn't have users, and we're in the process of reconciling them as people notice and message in. It's very frustrating that I can't take the purchase token, which is in our database, and search it within the Google Play console. It doesn't work that way, even though it is there. They just don't allow to search by it. And I don't know if that's a security thing or whatever. So we kind of have to look at the receipt. I mean, if we have the order ID, that's okay. But then I'll copy the purchase token, go back to my database just to cross-reference that it is the correct one. But the platforms are different and the capabilities are different. So navigating that is also interesting.
I think for those listening that have this dream that one day you're going to be the solo developer and you're just going to have passive income because you built this application and you just you just make money at night while you're sleeping. It's kind of true, but also these are real world situations that you'd be navigating. And so maybe there will be some benefits in the future with the changes coming. Everybody's talked a lot about the 30% thing as being the reason why it's a hurdle, but I also think there's a lot of other complexities that I don't think we talk about enough as well. But like, to keep these systems in sync is complicated.
And also, I am a couple major versions behind on Stripe right now. I need to sit down soon and catch up. But it's one of those things where every time I upgrade a major version of Stripe, I have to be super careful about what the breaking changes are so that I don't break everything and then I end up with a bunch of subscriptions that like don't go through or whatever. The great thing about Stripe is really good with its like callback and retry functionality. So when we fixed this bot issue, I didn't have to do anything on the Stripe end. It was all they just retried all the things later, or I manually kicked off some of them to just go again, and everything was reconciled almost on its own. But because of this disconnect kind of between the device and the App Store and the Play Store and then my Rails app, that didn't happen with the Google and the app stores.
This episode of On Rails is brought to you by Before Action, the Rails developer's choice for treating early-stage duplication syndrome. If you've been copying the same set of code into every show, edit, and update method, you may be suffering from early-stage duplication syndrome. Symptoms include cluttered controllers, missing authorization checks, and frequent bouts of, I thought I already wrote this. But there's hope. Before Action helps extract shared logic into clean, reusable callbacks so you can focus on what really matters, naming your methods something that makes sense 6 months from now. Side effects may include increased maintainability, dryness in code, spontaneous controller refactors, and that haunting realization that you forgot to before action set user in one controller. Ask your team lead if before action is right for you. Before action, proudly preventing controller deja vu since 2005. Given that your application's running, you have a global audience and customer base, even for just like for those might be using the web app, has Stripe been limiting at all? Like, had there been scenarios where people are like, hey, I'd like to be able to pay with PayPal because we don't really use credit cards where I live, and trying to think about and like that was always a big thing for some of our customers. They'd be like, well, we had our developer, we got this MVP out the door, we used this Stripe gem, we used Stripe as a backend, but now we have people that want to pay us in a different way that Stripe doesn't support. So can we tack on PayPal really easily? And I'm like, it's going to be a lot more complicated than you think to do that because we're so reliant on Stripe at the moment. So have you encountered that type of thing as well?
I am so glad you mentioned that. That is a big reason of why I'm sticking with Apple's 30%, because with Apple Pay and Google Play, PayPal comes built in. So they have because you can pay through different wallets. That's all built in with the in-app purchases. And so, yeah, that's a big reason. We had so many requests for PayPal. Another one was Ideal, the Netherlands app, which you can do through Stripe. But yeah, PayPal was a big one. And so that's where sticking with the in-app purchases has been super helpful, because there's a whole list of, like I said, different wallets and different ways to pay that come with having that being connected to those systems.
Do you think you would have approached that differently if you were to start it today?
I think if I were to start today, I would just go straight away with Turbo. Honestly, I would just go straight away with Turbo, get the web app, iOS and Android app out straight away. And something I've been really careful to do is release changes to iOS and Android at the same time. And sometimes Android first, because most of our mobile users are on Android. And the number of messages we get that say, wow, this is so amazing that we're being looked after first. Or even when I post something, and because I have an iPhone, I also now have an Android as well, because it got to the point where it's like, I'm looking over at my pile of 3 phones over here. But it got to the point where it's like, okay, Nadia, you can't keep relying on your simulator. You need to get a phone. But because my personal phone is an iPhone, most of my mobile screenshots are from an iPhone. And when I have released something and it is everywhere, the number of comments of, will we get this on Android too? Or will we get this on Android soon? And it's like, it's already there. And this is, again, where Turbo has been super helpful. It's very funny, given that I know how it works, how I can push some of the changes, or a lot of the changes are web deployment, right? And it's so interesting when people go, oh, I don't think it's on the Android app yet. And it's just that they haven't maybe looked to the right place or something. And I'll be like, no, it's there, it's everywhere. Or, oh, I don't think this is rolled out to me yet. And it's like, no, you've got it. Because I know that I've just done a web deployment. And so now everybody has it.
It touches on the thinking about the topic around PWAs or not being it's kind of like, this would be great if everybody did this, but I was just interviewing Joe Mazzalotti recently for Maintainable, and he was talking about like people don't save the links on their bookmarks. People just don't do it that often. Yes, you get like push notifications and things like that, but like who's doing that? Like maybe some developers, but like the average consumer. And there's also the other aspect of it being discoverable in the app stores, right? And like, so people might be looking for that, and that might reach a different audience. Do you have any stats on percentage of people that found you because of that? Or has it mainly been through hearing about it in the press, or, coming across someone recommending it? And
I think it's mainly in the press, but you made a good point of, before we went on the App Store, we had so many people say, oh, it's not in my country, because they've just gone immediately to the App Store. And even anecdotally, like me talking to people, even before we had apps, and them immediately opening up the App Store or the Play Store on their phone and typing, what's it called? And I'd have to be like, oh no, it's not in there. When we have had good press, then we go up the rankings. So there have been a couple of times where we've been number 1 in the App Store in books, number 2 in the US and the UK. We're generally, top 20. I'm not sure where we are now, but we're generally up there. And I think just being up there means we're discoverable. We're probably sometimes with other book apps, we might be showing up in the related to kind of thing. So definitely helps. And also I've I've been featured on Apple for Black History Month a couple of times, and they link to the app and on their Today page. So if we didn't have the apps in the store, there would be nothing for Apple to reach out to me about to feature me. And then that,
right. That's an interesting part about the story there of your application being discoverable, findable. I don't know where you go today to find like what are the top 5 web apps.
Good point.
Where is that place? Is it Product Hunt or whatever? Like that's when new things get launched.
Someone reached out to us because they had submitted a pull request to Simple Icons. And because of our terms of service, the maintainer had said, we need formal approval from them before we're going to merge in this pull request. And I noticed when I looked at the pull request that they used that, what's it called? That global index where it says where your website ranks in the world and in the States. I've seen it before. It's really cool. Like in the world, we're 11,000 and something. And in the US, we're 4,000 and something, which I thought was pretty cool. But I guess but that's not like a general, it's not the same as being in the App Store, the Play Store.
And that also is, I think, a lot to do with like traffic data. And someone get a lot of traffic doesn't mean that they're getting a lot of customer acquisition necessary. So I don't know how you calculate, how do you weight those things, I guess.
You're right.
You have a product, people are paying for, logging in. You have there's a free account level, right?
Oh yeah, and like 98 or 99% are free.
Okay. As your app has scaled, I think you mentioned millions of users at this point, which is quite an accomplishment. And if anyone hasn't seen Nadia's talk from, I think it was RailsConf last year, 2024, you had a great talk. And is it safe to assume you've continued to grow quite a bit since then?
Yes, that talk was getting to 2 million users as a one-woman dev team. We are now over 4 million users. I will say that's registered users. We have about a third who are active, which is a very healthy active rate. We look at monthly active users because the average person reads a book a month. But on our busiest days, we have over 1 million unique visitors.
Doing a little bit of prep for this conversation, I know that you recently worked to transition from just using Postgres database to Yugabyte. I'm not sure how to pronounce that database, and which is, I think, a Postgres compliant, like it's supposed to be Similarity. I wasn't familiar with it, to be honestly, before reading about this, but I'm kind of curious, what prompted that transition?
January 1st is always our biggest day. And in general, the end of the year into the first couple of weeks of January are our busiest time because people essentially go into the new year saying, I'm going to read all these books. They start reading challenges. They set a reading goal. It's like, going to the gym. It's a big thing. If you're someone who tracks your reading, you want to start on a new reading app on January 1st. So we see the pickup. The app is basically down for the first couple of weeks of January. We realized that the database was the constraint. Now, I had done some work on queries, but we couldn't figure out what was going on. And what we came to was realizing that ultimately we needed a way to horizontally scale Postgres because we'd gotten like the biggest specs. We'd moved off of Heroku because we were on that was a sustainability thing. We were on one of their highest plans and it was costing us like $8,000 a month. And this is before we even had a premium plan. So we were like, we need something way more sustainable because every time we grow and have a spike, we get so many more users. And essentially the app is very write heavy because when it's our busiest time, that's when also everybody's importing their Goodreads as well. And so it's very, very write heavy. And we needed just a way to just horizontally scale Postgres. We tried a bunch of things. So I had tried optimizing queries, but it just wasn't doing enough. Rails also there was a built-in multi-DB setup, which I did set up. But the issue why that didn't work is because for that to work, the code or the setup is very strict about having like clean GET requests. So there should be no like data transformation or things like that. And my controller code is not that clean. So it doesn't respect the whole like GET requests should not be transformative in any way. Like there shouldn't be any like updates to data, but there would be things like, for example, when you go to a giveaway page, I increment a view or impression in the database or however I do it, that is not sticking to how it should be. So I just couldn't get that set up without a big code refactor. So that didn't seem worth it. We discovered Makara, the Ruby gem, but we had an issue with replication. The replication just couldn't keep up. Like the time window was either too far so that such that users would notice. So essentially that didn't work. And that's when Rob was doing research and he discovered Yugabyte, and he said, he did a bunch of research. I was very nervous to move over to this, but he was like, you won't really have to change your code because it's, like you said, it's like a Postgres adapter, and it will enable us to scale horizontally. We can just easily increase and decrease servers based on our load. So let's go for it. And so that's what we did. And it's had challenges, but we're on Yugabyte, and there's still stuff we're figuring out. They're still trying to get the configuration right. In fact, there were certain queries that were not written well for a distributed database, and that we've kind of had to be working through those. We had to convert queries to use CTEs a lot, common table expressions. So it's just been a learning curve for us, and definitely needed way more indexes than we had before. And so basically working through that, we're still working through that, is what we're doing right now. Overall, it did work well because on January 1st, we didn't crash. We were able to support 13,000 concurrent users, whereas before we were crashing at like 6,000. So we were able to support double the number of concurrent users, like about 1 million operations a second or something like that. So it's worked, but there have been some other issues that have cropped up, and there are some things that are still quite slow, and we need to like rewrite queries, make sure our indexing is structured well, set up well, and things like that. So we're just working through that.
When you were looking at that scenario, do you feel like using a tool like that has smoothed out that situation for early in the year, those types of scenarios? Like, we need to solve this so that we're ready for when those peak moments happen. And you also mentioned you had DDoS attack at least once, and maybe you brought Cloudflare. And do you ever feel like you're maybe over-resourced at all, and like thinking about how to I'm paying for stuff we're not using necessarily, and like when you're thinking about your margins and such?
Yes, that's actually a big thing with us sometimes, because Rob and I, this is again the trade-off of being like a one-person dev team, a two-person tech team. Sometimes when we're talking about solutions, I'll sit there and I go, but surely I can write these queries better. Do we need that much hardware? But then we always come down to time limit. Okay, January 1st is around the corner. We don't have time for you to rewrite all these queries or look. It's like, let's just throw money at it. We have the money. Let's just throw it at it and worry about it next time. And it's already May. And so that's kind of what's happened a lot of the time. Even when we were on Heroku, it was like, let's just go to the next database plan. Let's go to the next database plan. Let's go to the next Elasticsearch. One of our issues and of why we also needed to get off Elasticsearch is we were on the highest available Elasticsearch plan, and it wasn't good enough for us. And also the support was terrible, and the metrics were terrible. And so we just needed to move off.
What did you end up switching to?
We just run it like ourselves now on our own hardware. We don't use a service anymore. We are definitely over provisioned. I think part of what I want to do this year and what I'm working on is I'm dedicating a lot of time to performance, understanding how our queries work, optimizing the queries so that we can get to the point where we're not so over provisioned. Because definitely just being a small team, being constrained by time often and resources, like the spikes just come, we don't know when an article is going to come out or an influencer is going to post something about us. And now we suddenly got 10,000 people on the app, and I don't have time to rewrite things. So we're just going to throw money at the problem. So we're definitely over-resourced, I think. But it's one of those things where luckily we have the resources. We are profitable. We're completely bootstrapped. And so we can, but we don't like doing it for too long.
No.
In fact, we had a lot of a slowdown in January because we had massively over-provisioned. I think Rob had gotten like 50 database servers. And then when it had quietened down, we cut that right back. But it wasn't enough for the slightly higher day-to-day traffic we had. And he had ordered certain specific servers because we realized that one of our bottlenecks was to do with network. It was network bandwidth that's a completely new issue now that we have, network bandwidth between the database servers. And so he'd ordered a certain custom setup, and they just took weeks and weeks to come. And it got to the point where we just over provisioned again with the current kit we had because the app was too slow in the meantime, when before we were fine on the 3 servers, but we're not anymore.
So I think this is a good time to zoom out a little bit. So like you're not just building the story graph, you're also running the business, shaping the roadmap, supporting users. It's a lot of hats to wear. So how do you keep that context and momentum when you're doing it all by yourself?
If someone asks me, what's your biggest challenge or struggle? I always say, wondering whether I'm spending my time well. And I think if one thing that I'm trying to move towards is having more focused coding blocks in my day, especially as I'm digging into the performance, stability, maintenance, that kind of stuff now. I've put a feature freeze on because it just got to the point now where too many reviews are like, I love this app, but it's so slow, or it takes this long to load this page, and these are solved problems. This shouldn't be the case anymore. And so I've kind of put a feature freeze on, and I'm just focusing on performance. But that kind of stuff needs a lot of context and focus. It's not like a little feature that you could just dig in for 20, 30 minutes, do a bit of code and go off. And so I'm in the process of, through putting boundaries on when I'm going to have meetings or calls. I rarely take meetings or calls anyway, but I'm being extra strict now. I'm actually not taking any more podcast interviews and things. You were very lucky. You were one of my exceptions. I was like, it's Robbie. I've got to do it.
Thank you.
I'm saying no to a lot of stuff. I'm trying to clear up my days so that I can get more focused coding blocks, because essentially I live by my calendar and everything is in there, but I'm really struggling to dig into the nature of this work. It just needs focused time. So I'm actually currently trying to just get more of those coding days, because I think, I'm running social media. I'm, like you said, running the business, managing a team. I'm doing all these things. And, people often go, why don't you just hire someone? I think it's so easy to just say, why don't you hire someone? And even though we have money in the bank, once you hire someone and you pay them well, just hiring one person comes with a lot of extra admin. I mean, we recently hired a designer on like a consulting term, and the time it took for me to kind of onboard her, figure out the arrangement, check in, deal with certain issues that we had, review the work, all this kind of stuff, that was so much time away from me, from everything else I was already doing. So it's a trade-off, like being a one-person dev team. And I always feel like, personally, if it ever gets to the point that I feel like I'm at the peak of my productivity and it's still not enough, then I'll seriously look into hiring extra dev support. But I just know that I'm not at the peak of my productivity. Even though I'm a very productive person, I just know that, like I said, I haven't structured my days well. I've got a lot of hobbies outside of work. And I just need to kind of restructure my days and be more strict with the timings of certain things. And maybe say, like, on these days, I don't have lunch with a friend, or you know what I mean? Things like that. So I know I'm not at the peak of productivity and organization in that respect. And so that's what I'm figuring out right now.
I was going to ask if you ever considered bringing on another developer. It does seem like the obvious question I think people would ask. And so when I talk with freelancers versus people that run software consulting companies, like, there's very different business model. And it's not just like, oh, I hired one more person, now we're a consultancy or an agency. It's like your responsibilities as the business owner drastically change, like overnight, like drastically, as soon as you start bringing other people into it. I think it's great that you're fighting the good fight to try to keep that solo developer thing. Rails providing the one-person framework for you to do that within. Is it safe to assume you might tug on someone's shoulder every once in a while, like, hey, can I get some help, or can I get some advice from your Ruby community of people? And like, hey, I have this weird issue. Is that another benefit of using Ruby on Rails, is that you can reach out and ask people for some advice on something?
Yes. When I started, it took a lot for me to ask for help, because I had this feeling of, this is my business and other people have their work and their businesses, and I just need to get on and do it. But I have my newsletter and lots of Ruby people follow me there. And actually, I had these database issues when we were on Heroku and I couldn't figure them out. And I remember Andy, a good friend, Andy Kroll, replied to one of my issues and said, which Heroku plan are you on? And I was like, the $50 one. And he said, that's your problem. Like, it never, until that first message, it never occurred to me at that time that I needed to go to the $200 plan. This was like in the first year when it was still beta. And I was like, oh, I've been trying to do all these optimizations. And Andy said, yeah, sometimes throwing money at it is actually the solution. With the number of writes we're doing, the $50 database is never going to be the same. And then there have been a couple of times when I've been really stuck and I have paired with friends, particularly when it was just me in the early days. And then more recently, I actually did reach out to Joe Mazzulotti, who helped me before he knew who I was. I had actually reached out to him on Twitter when I was trying to figure out the Turbo in-app payments and a couple of other things, JavaScript bridge. I couldn't get it working. And I was just like, I need help. And I started DMing him. He didn't know who I was. Now we're friends. And more recently, we did a little bit of work with him to have him kind of go over the app, review it, and help us say, because my goal is I want it to be indistinguishable from a native app as close as possible. I know that I'm not getting the most out of Turbo Native. Haven't even started using Strata yet. Even Rails sometimes, like I'm on all the newsletters, but I feel like I never have time to dig into them. And I just know I'm not getting the most out of Rails yet. We're still on Rails 7. And so in times of desperation, like I can count the number of times I have actually directly reached out to people, but it's kind of rare. I just kind of figure it out. And I just think that's one of the trade-offs of you're this one person team. And part of it is things don't happen quickly because you're figuring stuff out. And one thing I will say, like going on from, just hire someone, I would never not hire someone if I thought it was to the detriment of the company and the product. But, a big part of a startup is the story and the brand. And this one woman dev team is really, really working well for us, especially in the face of, anti-big tech sentiment, anti-VC, all this kind of stuff. And so being like, it's this one woman who's going up against Amazon and building a Goodreads alternative, that does work really well. It's not an ego thing or I'm going to just stick to this forever because I can't let this mantle go. No, not necessarily. But in the face of, I know that I could be more productive. I know that I have friends that I can reach out to. Lots of the problems that we're up against, there are bigger Rails apps out there. So there's solved problems. There are just so many avenues and resources still that it's not worth bringing on another person because of all the other hidden issues. And like you said, it's a whole responsibility. Now you're someone's paycheck. There's so many other things that come with it. So I'm happy for now.
I appreciate you diving into that particular point there, because I think from the outside, I was always kind of like, that would be such an interesting pivot to start bringing in other people because it is part of the story of StoryGraph. And I'm like, would pride ever get in the way of that? Or, like you mentioned ego. And it's like, that's got to be a challenging thing to navigate as well. And I think a lot of people listening might be in similar situations doing their own thing and like, hey, I've started this freelancing thing and I'm going to keep doing this thing for a while. And it gets bundled up into their identity. And there's a lot of, and like they're known in the community for this certain thing. Like there's a lot of things for us to kind of navigate there. And I think this is a great story as well. And so I appreciate you coming on and talking about that. I'm also thinking about within the guards of Rails and StoryGraph, and you being able to reach out to people. Do you ever find yourself having time to, maybe the answer is no because you're so busy, but looking at how other tech stacks might be approaching things and being like, what could we learn from them that I wish that we kind of had in our ecosystem? Or is it just like, I don't have the time for that?
I wish I had more time, not necessarily even looking at other code bases, but for example, I'm on the Hotwire newsletter and I see these headlines or the blog posts that's like, I'm trying to think of an example that's actually applicable that I've saved. The one in my mind right now is like real-time collaborative chat, which is not something we're trying to add at the minute. But I've bookmarked a few things being like, oh, let me look into this and dig into this because this would improve this feature. And I just haven't made the time. And so this is where I go back to, I just feel like I'm also not getting the most out of what Rails and Hotwire and Turbo is giving me built in. And so I don't know whether I need to set aside some time to actually do that. The way I kind of approach things is like pain-driven development or priorities. So if enough people complain about something or it's time to improve something, in my mind, I'm like, oh, I'll just go into my emails and I'll search this term and find that blog post again. Or some of them I put into my project tracker, which until very recently was Pivotal Tracker. Yes, I know some people listening may think Pivotal Tracker, that's a lot for a one-person dev team. But I was a pivot and that's all I know. So I'm using Linear now. I like it, actually. I like how it's set up. So I'm a few weeks into using Linear. So sometimes I'll find a relevant story and I'll put a link to a blog post or something. And sometimes I get to them, but I definitely feel like, yeah, there's more I could be doing on that side of things. But maybe people might listen and go, look, as long as your thing works,
Right.
and, that's fine.
Seems like you've been able to keep it relatively up to date with new versions of Rails 7. Talked to a lot of companies who are like, I'm working on Rails 4.
That makes me feel really good, because I was like, oh, is it bad I'm not on Rails 8? And then I looked at the date of when the last, like Rails 7, December 10th, 2024, and like that's still fine.
Yeah. It is. It's still fine. It's good. It's actually good. So kudos there. A couple of quick last questions for you, Nadia. Is there a programming book or maybe something that's somewhat tech adjacent that you find yourself recommending to people?
When you say people, do you mean, I guess
Peers.
Most of the people peers. Oh, peers, not really, because I honestly feel so behind everybody. Like, I honestly feel so detached from what's current in Ruby and Rails, honestly. So when I'm asked to keynote or even to do this podcast, I was a bit like, do I need to do research for this? Because I feel like I'm not actually up to date with the latest on Rails. So peers, not really. I mean, I haven't read a tech book in so long. If anything, if it comes to like people trying to get into code, then it's the classics, Puda, 99 Bottle, Ruby Under a Microscope, I loved. So if people want to know more about, I guess if I was to recommend a book to peers, it would be Ruby Under a Microscope if people haven't read it already, because I think it just really shows you, it's just fascinating, like learning about Ruby the next level down. It was, by the way, the inspiration for my debug series of talks. And Saron, Yabarak, and I, we used to do the Ruby Book Club podcast where we'd read a chapter of a tech book each week. And then if we could interview the author, and we interviewed Pat Shaughnessy. And I loved that because we said, how did you come to write this book? And he said, well, I wanted to learn more about Ruby internals because I didn't know anything. And so I was like, I'll write a book about it. And I just love that so much. And you can see that fun, exploring, learning nature within the book. So I guess for peers, I would say Ruby Under a Microscope by Pat Shaughnessy.
Definitely include links in the show notes for everybody. I think one of the things I think about whether or not you feel like you can keep up on all the newest things, I think the honest answer is most software developers in the Rails ecosystem can't. I can't, most people can't. And a lot of that comes from the fact that a lot of us are working on applications that are running in production. We can't just keep updating every time, or can't use the latest new thing because we've already made decisions. We're already integrated with Apple. We're already integrated with Android and Stripe and PayPal. And we can't just switch over to this new thing tomorrow because it's now available. I think the takeaway there is not that that's a problem. It's that Rails has given us enough to get started to work on the thing that we are most excited about, which is like our businesses or our projects or our products. And we don't necessarily need to be geeking out about the under the hood stuff and keeping up with, what the neighbors are getting to play with. It just means that whoever's starting a business today gets to take advantage of that immediately, because the stuff that came out in Rails 6, Rails 4 at the time was groundbreaking, and it lets you move really first. So we shouldn't look back at that and be like, I have a talk that I'm working on. And it's about looking back at that and be like, these were the first versions of ideas that we have today. And those are not bad versions. They were just previous purpose.
Yes. I love that perspective. Yeah, that makes me feel better. I'm fine. I'm doing good.
Well, Nadia, it's been such a delight having you join us on Rails Day with us. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us today and tell us a little bit about you and your journey with the StoryGraph.
Thank you for having me. It's been so fun.
That's it for this episode of On Rails. This podcast is produced by the Rails Foundation with support from its core and contributing members. If you enjoyed the ride, leave a quick review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. It helps more folks find the show. Again, I'm Robbie Russell. Thanks for riding along. See you next time.